Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. I got Kazi a new toy today and hopefully he won't be too loud with it, but welcome back to my channel. Hello friends! So today I am finally filming my April wrap-up. I think I'm probably the last person to do that, but here I am. I'm ready to film it. We're gonna talk about this. So I kind of put off filming this because largely I read mostly the Maiden Lane series. In April, I read through books 4 through 12. So I read the entire series. I had already read books 1 through 3. I am not going to be talking about those in this video because I have a dedicated video that is spoiler free that talks about all of my feelings and my ratings in that video. I'll have it linked below if you haven't seen it yet. So I read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 9 of the books I read in April were from the Maiden Lane series. That's kind of a lot. Where am I going to put these? Okay, so let's talk about the other books that I read. So I have been on a mission to read all of Kennedy Ryan's books, and so I went back to her first published series, and so these were the very first series that she wrote. It is a 4-book series, and it's all based around this one family called the Bennett family. So book 1 and 2 are really sort of a duet in that book 1 ends with a bit of a cliffhanger, so you really need to read both 1 and 2, and then books 3 and 4 are separate couples in the series. So book 1 is called When You Are Mine, and book 2 is called Loving You Always. So this is a contemporary romance series, and it was really fun for me to, because I'm a huge fan of Kennedy Ryan's, to go back to her beginning, her first published book, and read it and sort of compare it with more of her newer books, and just to see, I find that interesting to read an author's, like, to see where they started from and then to see where they're at today. I think that's really interesting and fun to do. And I will say that this book has Kennedy's trademark emotional impact in that she really uses situations with her characters. She puts them in places that you don't want them to go because it hurts you, and it was full of the emotional impact that you know and love and expect from Kennedy Ryan. I will say, however, that this beginning duet has to do with a love triangle between these 3 people, so 1 woman and 2 men, and at the end of book 1, it's really sort of unresolved what's going to happen. But it was a really beautiful love story. We have a lot of angst and a lot of emotional upheaval, and it was really worth it for me to go back and read these. I enjoyed these quite a bit. I gave both of these 4 stars. Okay, and the next book that I read was To Love and to Loathe. This book was an ARC that I received. This is a historical romance, sort of with a rom-com type of feel, and it is really different from the typical historical romances that we know and love. This book is about Lady Templeton and Jeremy the Marquess, and they are sort of at a ball one night, and they're kind of teasing and ribbing each other, and the night ends with Jeremy making a bet with Lady Diana that if she doesn't marry within a year, then he's going to pay her £100. And the plot gets a little further complex when Jeremy comes to her seeking reassurance that he is actually a good lover when he has received some negative feedback in that area. So this book had a very modern sense of, it had a really modern feeling of a rom-com, and it was mixed with a historical romance setting, and that was really a little bit off-putting to me because it didn't feel like a historical romance to me. It felt almost like a parody of a historical romance with the rom-com elements, and there were also large portions of this that were just sort of slow and dragging out, and I ended up giving this 3 stars. It was fine, but I feel like there are better rom-coms and there are definitely better historical romances out there. Okay, and the next book that I read was Kingdom of Flesh and Fire by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This is the second book in her series, I don't even know what the series is called, the Blood and Ash series. I ended up giving this 3 stars. This is a fantasy romance, and it has to do a lot with, well, our main characters are Poppy and Hawk, and I really do enjoy their love story and their romance, and this book was definitely a bit of an upgrade from the first book, in my opinion, as far as pacing and plot, and definitely the romance was better in this one. I ended up enjoying this one a lot more than I did the first one, and I gave this 3 stars. And I hesitate to give it more than 3 stars because I feel like Jennifer L. Armentrout does in this book what she did in the first book, which was just excessive info dumping and very lengthy passages that really could have been shown in a better way. But I am still really engaged in this couple's story, and I will definitely be reading the 3rd book. And like I said, I did really enjoy this one more than the first book. I felt like it was a little bit more faster paced. I felt like it was a little bit more tighter plotted, and it was just better in my opinion. So I gave this one 3 stars. Okay, and then I was still apparently on a fantasy romance kick, and so then I picked up Fortune Favors the Cruel by Kel Carpenter. This is book 1 in a fantasy romance series, and I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars. I felt like the fantasy world was very well developed. I really enjoyed the plotting in this. I really enjoyed the characters. The main premise of this book is we have a female former slave who has this big, powerful, dark magic, and she ends up being... This is a really fun book, I feel like, because she ends up being the female part of the morality chain when it's typically the man who is, you know, evil except for one person, and she sort of has that element to her, which I really, really enjoyed. I thought that was a really fun dynamic. The hero is a man who rescues her, who wants to use her dark power, of course, to bring about power in his kingdom. I do think that if you are going into this looking for a straight-up romance, you're going to be disappointed, but if you love fantasy and a really well-done fantasy, and you want sort of a slower-paced romance that builds throughout the series, I would highly recommend this because I felt like the fantasy world was great. There was some great sexual chemistry in here between the hero and heroine, but nothing specifically happened on page in here, but it is definitely set up to happen in the future. So this is an adult fantasy romance series, but the first one was just not a fully developed romance, but still super enjoyable. I really, really liked this one a lot. Okay, and the next book that I read was Rejected, Shadow Beast Shifters, and this book was very hyped on TikTok. Like, you cannot get on TikTok, well, I don't know if that's so much anymore, but at the time, this was all over TikTok. It was just promoted as this really great fantasy spicy book, and it did have some spice, but it was really disappointing to me in terms of the fantasy aspect of it, and it actually ends up being more of like a paranormal romance because they're werewolves and things like that. But the basic premise of this is that the heroine is an outcast from her werewolf pack because of something that her dad did, and she is trying to escape her fated mate, so it sort of has that trope where she's denying the fated mate pull, and it just ended up being a little bit all over the place. Like, the plot was just not great at all. Like, it really didn't have a central plot at all. It was literally just like all over the place. And the romance was really not there either because it was just too rushed or not enough, and it was really lacking subtlety in all of those elements, and I just felt like it was not great, and I don't recommend it. So 2 stars for this one. Okay, and the next book that I read was The Skits of Duke by Harper St. George, and I went into this with pretty high expectations. I had heard really good things about it, and I was set for a Gilded Age historical romance, and I ended up really liking this, but also being a little bit disappointed in some aspects of it. In this book we have the heroine, who is a very progressive heroine, and she is not interested in a marriage so much as she is running her family's business. And we have the hero, who has recently inherited the title of Duke, but of course is absolutely poor, so he has to marry a wealthy woman for that. So he ends up setting his sights on the heroine's younger sister, but she is like, oh no, dude, you're not gonna marry my little sister. And then of course they end up falling in love. I felt like the author's writing style was really great. I loved the writing style. I really loved the setting. I really loved the hero in this one. I thought he was very complex and very well developed, and there was an opening scene in here where he was doing some bare knuckle boxing, and he ends up asking the heroine for a kiss, and it was just really wonderful, and I was so set up for, like, this is gonna be great, you know, but then it really kind of fizzled after that, and it didn't quite deliver what I wanted it to. And I also will say that as someone who deeply enjoys feminist themes in their historical romances, I actually felt like this one was just a little bit heavy-handed with that, and that it started to overtake the whole plot of the book and not focus enough on the romance for me, and I was a little disappointed in that. But I am still really interested in reading more from this author, and I definitely want to pick up the second book in this series. I actually have an arc of that I need to get to soon. So 3 stars for this one. Okay, and the next book that I read actually ended up being one of my favorites for the month and is now my current favorite fantasy romance series, and that is A Promise of Darkness by Beck McMaster. I was incredibly impressed with this book. I feel like this is an underhyped gem. I don't hear a whole lot of people talking about this, and I feel like it is just really fantastic. If you are looking for a great fantasy romance that has a wonderfully piney hero who is just completely gone for the heroine, and but also like a really well-built fantasy world and an interesting and intriguing plot, I would definitely recommend this because it just hit everything that I wanted in a fantasy romance. This has Thiago, who is the prince of the Unseelie court, and he ends up in a sort of like a peace treaty deal with the queen of one of the queens of the Seelie court. And she is sending her daughter Vi to go to his kingdom for 3 months every year. So that has a very basic Hades and Persephone plotline there, but it's not a direct retelling. That's literally all the similarities, is that Vi, the princess, ends up going to the Dark Lord's kingdom for 3 months out of the year. And there is a little bit of a side, there's also a plot with Thiago's first wife in that he blames Vi's mother for killing his wife. So this book was honestly fantastic. It was intriguing. I just loved and adored it, and again, this is another author that I just can't wait to read more from. I am super impressed with her work and just absolutely loved this one. 5 stars for this book. Highly recommend it. Okay, the next book that I read was Enjoy the View. This is also an arc that I received. This is a contemporary romance, and this book centers on our heroine, who is a former Hollywood starlet who has really had to reimagine her career, and so she ends up working in documentaries. She ends up traveling to Alaska? Yes, Alaska. She ends up traveling to Alaska to work on this documentary, only to find that the people of Moose Springs are extremely inhospitable for her, and they're not really helping her with her documentary at all. So she sort of switches gears and decides that she's going to climb this really unclimbable peak that is known for being extremely dangerous. People have lost their lives on there, and she enlists the help of Easton, who is an expert about like nature and the wilderness around there. This had what seemed to be a really fun rom-com type of setup, but it really ended up falling short for me in a few ways, and one of them was just the heroine was a little bit insufferable. She was definitely leaned into a stereotypical spoiled brat type of Hollywood starlet coming to this small little town and trying to act like she was just like the bee's knees, you know? And also, I didn't love how she treated the hero. The hero was very sweet and very endearing, and I really liked him a lot. Also, this definitely hedged into more of like a survival type of book instead of so much a rom-com. So this had some really good fun elements of it, but ultimately I ended up giving this 3 stars and didn't super enjoy it, but it also wasn't terrible. Okay, and the next book that I read was How to Train Your Earl by Amelia Gray. I am absolutely in love with this cover. I think it's one of the most beautiful covers on a historical that I have seen this year. And I was super excited about this. This was also an arc that I received. This book was about Brenna, who is a widow, and she's decided since her husband has passed away, she's going to devote her life to the service of others. She ends up meeting Lord Black Knight, who was never supposed to inherit the earldom and was going to just live a life of debauchery instead, but somehow ends up inheriting the earldom and has to find a wife and be a reformed rake. So this is basically a historical romance with the spinster and the reformed rake, which can be really great. And while I do think that this book had some good points for sure, it was also really bogged down with a little bit of slowness, especially in the middle, and I didn't feel as emotionally invested in this couple's romance as I had hoped to. But I think that if you were looking for a spinster and reformed rake, then maybe give this a try and it might work better for you. Okay, the next book that I read was A Wicked Bargain for the Duke by Megan Frampton, and this book was also an ARC that I received, and I really ended up enjoying this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and this again has sort of a similar plot to some that I had read earlier this month, in that this is the Duke who is in desperate need of a bride. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to marry a respectable woman and secure an heir, and he sets his sight on someone who he thinks is going to be the perfect match for him. But that woman's sister is like, oh, no, you don't. No, you don't. So she actually ends up falling in love with the Duke, and he ends up falling in love with her. And it was really, this was honestly probably the best well done in this trope that I read this month. I really enjoyed it. It was a solid 4-star read for me. I thought that this couple had a lot of great chemistry. I thought there was really good humor, particularly in some of the bedroom scenes. It was just honestly a pure delight to read. It was also pretty low angst, and it was just a really fun time. I liked it a lot. The only drawback for me was just that the miscommunication lasted a little bit too long, but other than that, this was a really fun and enjoyable book. Alright, and the next book that I read was When a Rogue Meets His Match by Elizabeth Hoyt. This is book 2 in the Grey Court series, which is a spin-off of the Maiden Lane series. This book was so much fun. I loved this book. So in this book we have Gideon, who works for the Duke, and he is a man who does all kinds of unspeakable things to keep the Duke happy and to do all the dirty work basically for the Duke. And he is tasked with one last job that is really pretty heinous. He doesn't really want to do it, but if he does this job, then he is freed from the Duke's bidding, and he also will get Messalina, the Duke's niece, her hand in marriage. And good old Gideon has had a thing for Messalina for a very long time and has been pining for her very deeply. So he agrees to commit this job, which is basically a crime, and it has the potential to destroy his relationship with Messalina if she finds out. They do end up getting married, and they make a deal right in the beginning that he will not touch her unless she asks him to. So this book was full of just a ton of intrigue, a ton of mystery, a ton of steam, and a lot of sexual tension between these two characters, and I loved it. This was a 5-star read for me. It was great. It was everything I wanted in an Elizabeth Hoyt book, and I just freaking adored it. Okay, and the last book that I read in April was Marrying Winterbourne by Lisa Kleypas. I am trying to get through all of the Ravenel series before the new book comes out, Devil in Disguise, in July, I believe, and so this is book 2 in the Ravenel series. This is about Helen Ravenel and Rhys Winterbourne, and we see these two in the first book in the series, Cold-Hearted Rake. Their story actually takes up a large portion of that plot, and it was really very fun to read this and to see Rhys, who is a pretty unlikable hero and you don't really like him in Cold-Hearted Rake, just completely melt and come to his knees for Helen. I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. This is one of the best Lisa Kleypas books that I think I've read so far, although there are a few others, Derek Craven, that I love more than this, but this was still very much worth the hype. I really enjoyed it, and this was probably the perfect book to finish the month out for me. I absolutely loved this one. Okay, my friends, thank you so much for watching this very late wrap-up. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that my thoughts were a little bit coherent. The further and further we get away from the books that I read, the more that I'm like, what happened in this one now? But I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one.